Hello everybody and welcome to Flock Talk. Today we are going to be making some bird food, so let's get into it. We have got a whole load of produce to work with today. In this batch I'm going to be using a bunch of beets, including the beet leaves, acorn squash, a tri-mix of leaves, which is supposed to have red leaf, green leaf, and arugula, some red and orange sweet peppers, shredded coconut, baby carrots, a purple top turnip, cucumber, bee pollen. This one's a prickly pear. This one is not getting added into the chop itself. This is just kind of the special fruit of the week for the birds. Then we have a sweet potato, cauliflower, broccoli, and then some tops seed mix. The first thing we gotta do is clean all of our produce. I will clean the majority of them, but anything that I'm planning on peeling, like this acorn squash, I am not going to be washing right away, so I'm just going to peel it off and then wash it afterwards. This will also be going for the sweet potato as well, since that will also be getting prepped and cooked. But everything else we're simply just going to wash off in warm water, give it a good scrub, try and get rid of any bacteria or anything that could be lingering around on the vegetables. There are cleaners you can use for produce as well. I just don't personally opt to use them. I just try to use particularly hot water and give them a good scrub with a sponge or washcloth or whatever I have on hand. Just trying to get rid of the bulk of the bacteria or grime that could be hiding in the grooves of the produce. This is also a good opportunity to check over each of the produce items, double check that there's no bruising or anything that needs to be cut out. If I notice anything like that, I'll slice it out at this point in time. Otherwise, we're just primarily working on cleaning. So the first thing I'm going to prep is going to be the thing that takes the longest, and that is the sweet, it's a yam. It's a yam, not a sweet potato. This is going to need to be cooked, so I'm going to go ahead and get this guy ready. So I'm going to simply start by boiling a pot of water. While that water is working on coming up to a boil, I'm going to go ahead and take our yam and just peel it. After it is fully peeled and the outer layer of skin is totally gone, I will give it a quick wash before chopping it up into small pieces. Now, this is where I decide to put in a little extra effort, and I'm going to chop this up to the size that I want it to be when it's actually mixed into the chop. You could wait for it to cook and then cut it smaller and just dice it into consistent cubes, but I know I'm going to pretty much forget about it at the end of this, and I'm just going to be exhausted after I've cut everything else up. So instead, I'm going to chop this up now. So I'm going to have a bunch of different shapes and textures, a bunch of different sizes, which is not usually ideal when you are cooking a sweet potato. You usually want them to be pretty consistent in size so that way they all cook the same. But as long as you are checking the thickest piece when you're checking it to see if it's cooked, it'll be fine. You'll just have some pieces that are a bit more like mashed potato than they will like French fry shapes. I used to mash up sweet potato into a mush and make sweet potato balls out of it to convert my birds to eat good vegetables, but both of the current guys are really good with eating their foods, so I like to use this as an opportunity to take their favorite food, which is the sweet potato, and chop it into a bunch of different size shapes so they can have like a fun little surprise of getting just a big chunk of sweet potato in their chop one day and maybe not having sweet potato the next day. It kind of just adds a little bit more variety into their day if the food is made into different sizes versus being all consistently the same size every time. Sweet potato and yam is something that I add to every single one of my chops as much as I can, and it's not only because it's an extremely palatable food that a lot of picky birds will eat and take to, but also just because it has a significant amount of vitamin A in it, and it does incredible wonders for feather health. It ends up producing some super vibrant pigmented feathers, so I do my best to always add it, and then giving everything a thorough rinse in the strainer to make sure that it is as clean as I can get it. And usually by the time I'm done all of that, the pot of water is already up and boiling, and we can go ahead and just dump our potatoes straight in there. This will stay for about 5 minutes-ish. You're basically just wanting the potato to be soft enough for a fork to go through the thickest potato you have in there. It should slide through really smoothly, and that's how you know it's cooked enough for your bird. You could leave it here. I opt to then stick mine in the oven at about 350 degrees for, I don't know, 10-ish minutes, just to help dry it out a bit, because when you have boiled a sweet potato, it becomes very, very soft and has a lot of moisture in it. So if you were to pour that straight into your chop mixture, it can end up being very, very moist, and it can make your chop mixture really wet, which will then make some ingredients go really, really limp. With that out of the way, we'll go for some of the easy ingredients. I'm just going to take my sweet peppers, and I'm going to chop off the stems, and then I'll remove the big white block from the center. I try and leave any seeds if there are, since the birds do like them, but just the stems gotta go. and everything else can just get tossed into the food processor. I'm going to be selecting what items go into my food processor together based on their consistency. So I'm not going to put soft leafy greens in with this crunchy pepper because they're going to break down at different speeds in the blender or in the food processor. So by picking foods that are similar in texture, it'll make sure that things are able to blend evenly and have a really good consistency and texture when they come out of the food processor. So going in with the sweet peppers, I will have some baby carrots. A turnip will also be going in the same round with the food processor. I'm just going to make sure to peel it and give it another wash before chopping it up. And I'm just wanting to chop them into decently large-sized chunks. Because the food processor is going to do most of the work. I just try and make sure that it is distributed evenly and that the food processor is not trying to break down a huge clump. It's a little easier for it if it's in smaller pieces. So all of that's going to hop onto the food processor. I'm just going to pulsate it for a couple of seconds until it looks like it's a good consistency. Again, I'm aiming to make sure that there's a lot of varied sizes in the food, since that tends to make the chop a lot more interesting for the birds eating it. I purchased a way larger amount of produce than I would reasonably need for my 2 small birds. So I'm going to be doing this in several different batches in the food processor, and we're just going to be adding each batch into a large mixing bowl, and we will combine everything together at the end, because I have so much food that it is not all going to fit in the food processor at once, even if I wanted it to. Next, we'll do a batch of all of the softer vegetables. This is going to be all the leafy greens. I've got the green leaf lettuce and the red leaf lettuce from this head, and then I will also have a big chunk of the beet leaves. I'm going to make sure to pick through any of the ones that are looking a bit wilted. Just snap the stems into more manageable size for the food processor, and just add all of the leaves in. Same thing, blast it until I'm happy with the size that it's looking, and then go ahead and add it into the same mixing bowl with everything else, and just add it onto our big monstrous pile of vegetables. Leafy greens tend to be really good for the immune system's health. It also has a lot of vitamin A, C, E, and K, which are all important for general functioning of the body, but they also contain a lot of antioxidants and stuff that can protect the cells and just be overall really good for your bird. The next round I'm going to have a couple more beet stems hanging out, as well as the broccoli, which I'm just going to break all the florets off of and then chop the stem into more manageable pieces. And then go ahead, blitz that up, same thing, make it nice and chunky, and add it into our big mixing bowl, which is already starting to fill up and should probably be telling me that I'm not even halfway through my produce and this is already getting full. Things may not end up being fitting in here. We're going to move on to the big acorn squash. I avoid buying squashes because they're such a pain for me personally to cut. They're always so hard and I have such a hard time cutting them, but they are really, really good for birds, so I do want to add more of them when I can. I'm going to add half of this squash into the mix. I'm going to save all the seeds, give them a good rinse, and just pop them straight into the bowl. I don't want those to get chopped up. I kind of want them to keep their shape and let the birds have fun with them, breaking open the shells and getting the seeds that are inside. And then I'm going to do the painstaking process of peeling the squash with a knife. It does have a very thick outer shell, so it is a little more difficult, especially with the grooves that are in an acorn squash. But we make it work. We got it all removed. And then we're just going to chunk it into good-sized pieces and pop it into the food processor, along with some similarly textured, pretty firm cauliflower. Blitz that up again. I'm going to make this a little bit smaller. We'll make these some finer bits and add it onto our big chop pile. Next, I'll go on to the cucumber. I don't usually add cucumber to my chop because it is mostly water, but it is getting close to summertime now, and it's a good dietary variety thing to add, so I figure why not. So I'm going to chop these up by hand instead of using the food processor, just to have a little bit more variety, just so that way I have a bit more control over the size of the food. And then you'll see you'll have some really nice big chunks, and again, not every scoop I serve them is going to have a cucumber in it, so it'll make the chop seem a little bit different each day, even if it is technically the same chop. The beet is the bitter last vegetable that I'm going to do, and that is because it makes an absolute huge mess. I'm going to do my best to chop this down to quarters and then take the time to peel it before tossing it into the food processor and blitzing it up into this big blood red mess. Now you can add it in straight like this, but beets are a lot of juice. So I'm going to go ahead, dump these out onto a paper towel and give them just a gentle squeeze to help remove the bulk of the moisture. They're still going to be wet, they're still going to turn your whole batch red, but they will remove some of that moisture, so it's not going to be quite as bad as it would be if you didn't suck out the moisture between two paper towels before adding it onto the rest of the bowl. So as you can see, I've had to transition this into a much larger bowl. This happens just about every single time I make chop. I get all excited to have all the variety and all the different flavors and all the different foods and not really process exactly how much food that's going to make. So we're going to go on to the final touches here, which is the easiest part. I'm going to go ahead and just take the Tops seed mixture here and sprinkle it on top. This is not only to help encourage birds to eat it, because they do like seeds, they'll come and check them out, and if your bird happens to be picky, the seeds will have soaked up some of the fruit juices and have a little bit more nutrients than just eating plain seeds. If you keep your mix in the fridge, the seeds can also sprout in the fruit juices, and that will create a lot more nutrition for them. But I also do it because it does soak up the fruit juices, so it helps prevent the mixture from getting too soggy. Next, I add in bee pollen. Bee pollen is something I started adding when Newt was really bad with his plucking. It was an ingredient that had been mentioned on a forum as being a way to help plucking, something to do with allergies and micronutrients and stuff like that. So it's something I started adding way back then, and it did seem to help Newt. So now it's just an ingredient that I keep in all the time because I'm honestly just too scared to stop it and have Newt potentially start plucking again. So I add it every single time regardless. And then last I have some coconut flakes. This is just for variety, but it does also have a lot of good omega oils, which are good for skin and feather health, especially during molting seasons when they need a bit more of those fats to be able to produce all of the feathers and keep their skin from getting too dry and itchy. So when it comes to formulating any chop for any bird, there is a basic set of guidelines that I will use. This is a totally absurd batch with way more ingredients than what's necessary. At a minimum, what I always recommend doing is 2 to 3 different types of leafy greens, the darker the better, 1 to 2 different types of yellow or orange vegetables, and then 1 to 2 types of your reds or purples, and that will give them a good variety, cover your base nutrients, and be able to keep you mixing things up without things getting boring. So as you can see, by using the food processor, it doesn't just blend things up like a blender does, it will actually chop it into small pieces, and how long you run it will determine how small the pieces get. I try and do mine for as little as possible, so that way I still end up with a lot of texture in there. If you have a bird that is new to eating vegetables, you'll want to make the pieces pretty small, so that way they'll get a mouthful of mush basically and end up getting several different flavors in their mouth. But once the birds are more capable of eating a variety of vegetables without kind of picking and choosing the ones that they want and not wanting to eat half of it, if you can make the pieces bigger, I always recommend doing it, because one of the primary functions of feeding fresh foods is the enrichment that it provides, even less so than the nutrition. If they're on a good pelleted base, they're already getting their base nutrients covered, and chop is basically there for variety. It's being able to provide an additional form of enrichment, and if you just blend it every single day and it's the same consistency, it can get really, really boring. But if you chop it up a bit bigger, you have some fun with the piece shapes and the piece sizes, then you're introducing an environment that's a bit more fun, there's a lot more color and vibrancy to it, and it just creates a lot more enrichment for your bird. So now that this is all done, I'm going to pop some onto a plate. This is a way bigger portion than any bird would reasonably have in my house, but I know I'm not going to be able to fit this all in Tupperware, so might as well give them a huge serving. And we're going to see if Toto wants to test it out for us. And it is pretty quickly Toto approved. Toto is not a super picky bird from what I've been able to tell. He tends to demolish his chop. You can see he kind of goes for the seeds first and then quickly starts exploring the other produce options, start munching on all the other foods that are available, and he starts enjoying the different textures and the crunchiness of the different produce that's there. So even though seeds are in the mixture, he doesn't exclusively go searching for them, but they are a good way to initially grab his attention, get him tasting it, get the flavor of the vegetables, and then get a little more enticed to explore the rest of the plate. Around this point is when I realized that my sweet potato is still in the oven. So we're going to go ahead and pull the sweet potato out. And you're seeing the pieces are looking pretty dry. They're not looking quite as moist as they were before. So I'll go ahead and just mix that in real quick. We will take our apology piece of sweet potato and add that onto Toto's plate, since that is his favorite ingredient. And we will quickly go see if the little man would like to accept my apology and enjoy his sweet potato, which he happily does. Favorite ingredient, 10 out of 10. He would eat sweet potato all day, every day for the rest of his life and be a very content, happy little man. Now, Typically when I make a batch of chop, I do my best to only make a couple weeks worth. My fridge tends to keep chop completely fresh for up to a month, which is an absurd length of time, but it does. So I usually try and make one or maybe two of these containers that are able to just be kept in the fridge, and they'll stay fresh for that entire length of time. Obviously, in this instance, I made way more food than I meant. So Toto here is going to help me load up what ended up being 5 or 6 different containers, and in this case I will have to freeze it. I try to avoid freezing chop as much as possible personally, just because it does mess with the texture of the produce. It does tend to make things a bit mushy, which can turn birds off of their food sometimes, and I like keeping it fresher if I can and add more variety. So if I make a month's worth of chop, then every month they're getting a new variety of produce, and it makes it a bit more fun that way and a bit more nutritionally complete that way. But in this instance, I have made myself a good 6 months worth of food. So that happened, and we're just going to have to live with my life choices here. This chop ended up being quite the success. Both of my birds dove right into it and have been leaving completely clean plates since I've started serving it. So that's going to do it for today, but thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all in the next one. Bye! You watch your tail, hey?